me check it once.
Shiv, it says this was a free session sponsored by TeamViewer. Is that the...
That's me.
Can I take that off?
Yes.
Hey guys, thanks for tuning on. I'm just going to wait for a few more people to join, and we can get going soon. And I will be doing a Q&A at the end. So if you pop your questions in the chat, maybe just hold off for now in case I answer them. But throughout the webinar, if you pop your questions in the chat and we can go through them at the end. And sorry that you can't see me. With the YouTube Live, it was a bit difficult to get you to be able to see me as well. But that's not the important part. The slides are the important part. Sorry. I'm just waiting for a few more people, and then we can get going. While we're waiting, might as well have a chat with you guys. This feels really weird. How was your day? When are your interviews? How's your interview prep going? If anyone wants to chat in the YouTube chat, I'll just wait probably till 7:35. Thanks to those of you who are on time. But just if anyone's still on their way, and then we can start at 7:35. But if anyone wants to chat about anything in the chat, then we can do that for a few minutes. I am really sorry to anyone that got mixed up. Well, for my problem of getting mixed up with the days, I think it was a typo. I put in the 26th on the application form, but it was meant to be 25th because I was meant to be on a long day today, and today was the only day I could swap. And I was literally at handover, and I got an email from someone saying, "Is it meant to be today or tomorrow?" And I was like, "Oh my gosh, I've messed it all up." But yes, I will be starting in literally a couple of minutes. Actually, out of the people who are here right now, do you mind just saying in the chat when your interview is? Just so I can get a bit of an idea, if that's okay. Thanks, Venetia. 1st of March, that's good. So you've got all of February to revise. 2nd of Feb, 28th of Feb, 1st of Feb, 9th of Feb. Lots of them in Feb. Yep. And actually this year they're much quicker than they were a few years ago. In like when I applied, I think I had there were at least 6 weeks before the first interview, but this year it's been like a week or so. Okay, I think I'm going to start. So we begin. So yeah, pediatric ST1 interviews is what we're going to be talking about today. And my name is Dr. Radhika Thakrar. I am a pediatric ST3 at a hospital in London. And I remember how hard it was applying when I was ST1. To be honest, people didn't even do mock interviews or anything like this when I was applying. It's really happened over the last few years. So I decided to do this webinar to help people. I wanted to do mocks, but I don't have the time at the moment to arrange mocks, so I thought this would be the next best thing. So, aims of this session is just to outline the interview structure and go through each of the 4 components of the interview, and then we can do a bit of a Q&A at the end as well. It's aimed at people who are having interviews this coming year to start pediatric training in September 2023. It's not particularly aimed at medical students or F1s, particularly because it does sometimes change. But if there are any medical students or F1s here, you're welcome to stay and listen, or just people who aren't applying but here for more knowledge. And I just want to caveat that there's nothing specific for IMGs, but many things will be applicable. Also, to add to that, there's nothing specific for ST3 or 4 interviews, because I have not taken part in that process and I don't know a lot about it. But again, things might be helpful and applicable. So that's just something to bear in mind. So just to go through the timeline again, a lot of you will have seen this and know this timeline very well. But essentially we are here where the interview windows are now open from next week. Yep, from next week, which is so soon. And I'm sure many of you will have your interview already. And the interviews will take place mostly over February and the beginning of March. And then you'll hear about whether or not you have an offer at the end of March. This is just to go through. So although it says that, although there's a region assigned to each date, it doesn't actually meet that. That doesn't really have much bearing on you because the interviews are online. So I wouldn't stress about that. I wouldn't even think about it, to be honest. Just you can just do your interview with whichever one it is. And I know you've already got your interview dates, but it doesn't have any relevance really on your actual interview itself, other than who's managing the interview and probably where the interviewers will be from. So just to go through the format of the interview, many of you will know this. So it's a 40-minute virtual interview. My interview was face-to-face. I was the last year face-to-face, but they've been doing virtual interviews over the last 3 years now. So the way it's run is that they're going to do 2 20-minute stations. So you'll have 20 minutes with 2 interviewers, and then you'll switch stations and do another 20 minutes with another 2 interviewers. You'll do station 1 will be the communication section and the career motivation section. And then station 2 will be clinical reasoning and your reflective practice. And as I said, you'll have 2 clinicians scoring you, and then their scores will be collated together at the end, and also just moderated as well slightly, just to check that they're similar. And then to go through, so I'm pretty sure this is the timings. They haven't explicitly stated this on any of the RCPCH documentation, but they said that the 20 minutes will be shared evenly. So all of your interviews will start with the communication station. So you'll have your 5 minutes to read and to think for the communication station, and then you'll have the 10-minute scenario, and we'll go through that in more detail. Then you have your career motivation and portfolio station, and then that's when you then switch your interviewers and your clinicians who are scoring, and then you'll have your reflective practice and your clinical thinking. And I assume these will be 10 minutes, but don't quote me on that, because they haven't actually stated anywhere how long each one will be. So they've said that the whole thing should be done in 45 minutes. So actually, sorry, that top thing should say 45, not 40. So it's this year they're using a system called Coopercom. I've not used it before, but I just thought I would just show you. This is a picture we got off the internet to show what it looks like. So this is for what it will look like for the interviewer. So they'll be marking you at the same time as having you on their screen. And for when you log in, it will be a similar format. But like I said, I've not used this before, but this is a new thing that RCPCH are using this year. And it's just helpful to kind of know what it will look like. So we'll go through the communication station first of all. So I've taken, for each section, I've just taken screenshots of exactly what the applicant guidance says on the RCPCH website. So I'm sure many of you have read this, and if you haven't, I would strongly recommend that you do. But just to go through the communication station and what they've written, the main things are that they're going to assess your ability to interact with the patient, parent, or carer. And then they've said that this scenario will involve either an explanation of a clinical condition or reasons for an intervention or transfer. I think that this we'll go through some of my thoughts, but I think there are some other things you should think about as well as explanation and reasons. And it will just be you and the role player. So when you log on, when you have your first 5 minutes to think about, and then when it gets onto the Coopercom system, there'll only be one person there, and that will be the actor. And the assessors will then be marking what points they're given. They'll be marking you on the points that they've been given and the scoring framework. So like I said, you'll see the actor, and the actor will either be the patient themselves or the parent. So it's probably useful at the beginning, just like you would have done at medical school. Just say, can I just check, am I talking to, like Catherine, and are you Catherine's mum? Or can I just check, am I talking to Catherine, you're the patient, just to help with yourself, especially because you're kind of trying to overcome some of the differences of having it online. And then I think it will be really helpful to have a think about how you should use your 5 minutes. So obviously you're going to read the scenario and you're going to be really nervous and your heart's going to be beating really fast. So first of all, I would say use that 5 minutes just to help calm yourself down. So read the scenario, take some deep breaths and compose your thoughts, because this can be a really useful amount of time just to help think, how am I going to tackle this, or how am I going to do this communication station? So it's useful to think, well, first of all, what kind of questions are you going to start with? And I think that's really useful to have in your head, so that once they start talking to you, you kind of know what my first thoughts. So the things you should think about, again, is clarifying who they are. I think it's quite useful, especially in these sorts of things, just to clarify what they understand so far. And it's hard for me to give you exact thoughts because it depends. It's nuanced as per the situation and the scenario. But it might be helpful to kind of ask them, like, what do you understand so far? Or can I just clarify a few things, just so that you can get yourself into the mode of the consultation. It might also be helpful to think about what kind of reactions they might have. So maybe just kind of building a little bit of a mind map in your head. So for example, say, this is just an example I'm making up on the spot, but say the scenario says you've been asked to speak to the parents of a patient, or let's say the dad of a patient who's angry about the treatment plan. So I guess you could think, what kind of classical responses might they have and what direction? So they might get more angry. They might actually be upset about something. They might agree with you, or they might completely disagree with you. So kind of just think, how might this go and how would I tackle each one? That might be useful to think about. And then I guess how would you define it to be a success? So obviously if you end up saying, well, we've got to get a court order to have your child have this treatment, that's not necessarily a successful communication. But if you end up having a collaborative approach to this child's management plan, that's what you would kind of think of as a successful communication. So just in your head, kind of have that light at the end of the tunnel of what exactly do I want to aim for here. So I'm going to go through some communication things. These might seem very obvious, or they might not. They might seem like you might think, Radhika, we're not a medical school, but I'm just going through these because this is what you're being tested on. And they actually say in the applicant guidance and on some of the content that the RCPCH have online that they're kind of expecting you to be at a level of an F2. So you're not a registrar, you're not a consultant, you're not even an ST1 or 2. They kind of say that you're at F2 level. So although these things might seem obvious, especially when you're nervous, and especially because you probably haven't done an interview before, or very few people at this point have done interviews before. I definitely hadn't really done one. It's good to think about these sorts of things. So always remember to introduce yourself and establish that rapport. Introducing yourself can seem so basic, but just make sure you do it. And again, you do that day to day at work, so it will help just kind of ground yourself and get you into the flow a little bit. And then, like I said earlier, checking their understanding and just checking the context. I've always found that quite a helpful way. So when I did my clinicals especially, I found that quite a helpful way to kind of just make sure I understood the situation a bit more and make sure I didn't assume anything from the clinical scenario, because it's quite easy to assume things based on the scenario, but kind of just use this interaction with the patient or with the parent actor to double check what's a fact, I guess. And anything that's not really important, the actor will kind of sway you. I think personally that the actor will kind of sway you in the right direction, but obviously that's just my own thought. As usual, give the patient and parent, or give the actor, the person you're talking to, time to speak. That's just as it is when we speak to our own patients. Just let them talk if they want to talk. You might have a scenario where actually they don't want to talk, and obviously you need to take things a bit in a different direction, but give them time. I think even the use of silence can be really powerful. If you have a quiet patient or a patient who's upset or angry, still use the pauses effectively to kind of give them that time to speak if they want to. And again, some actors may then kind of use that silence appropriately to then fill it in and tell you what they want to say. So just be mindful that, I know even though it's an assessment, an interview, it's nerve-wracking, using time and using silence appropriately can really help. Now, don't forget the importance of non-verbal communication, and that's even harder on an online interview. And like I said, I didn't do an online interview, so these are just the sorts of things that I really think are important for when you are having an interview online. So non-verbal communication, I think the things that really help is nodding frequently, just to show that you're actively listening. Eye contact, and that's hard, but eye contact with your camera particularly can really help. Obviously you've got to balance that with looking at the patient or looking at the screen to look at the patient, but kind of trying to give eye contact and look up at the camera or to make them feel that you're looking at them. And your posture is also really important. So don't lean back in your chair. Even right now while I'm talking to you, I'm leaning forwards, even though you can't see me. I'm leaning forwards. I'm actually using my hands. So do use that non-verbal communication as well. Or if you're having to explain something, the use of your hands can be really helpful as well. So just like the first thing we're going to do is this, the second thing we're going to do is that. Use your hands appropriately. But just because you're on a computer and there's a screen there, kind of try to pretend that's not there and that there's a real person in front of you. And this is a really good thing you can practice, and I'll talk about practicing at the end, but it's a really good thing you can practice. And also I think it's really helpful to record yourself if you're practicing. So literally try and get a friend to do a Zoom call with you and do a practice online scenario and practice how you're going to do your non-verbal communication and see what your friend thinks. And then if you screen record it, then you can also review that and judge it yourself. Make sure you use a good mix of open and closed questions. Again, seems very basic, but that kind of thing scores you marks from what I understand. So just make sure you use that appropriately. And even when you're at work, coming up to it, even if you're not doing formal interview practice, just think, actually, if I were in a scenario right now, am I using open and closed questions appropriately and in a good way? Now, summarizing and checking knowledge, I think, is always a really good and important thing to do. I think it also helps me as a doctor, or even if you're in an interview, it will help you just to kind of gather your thoughts and make sure you're not missing anything, and make sure you haven't misunderstood anything. So that's something I did a lot when I was doing my communication stations for my clinical exams. And just to clarify, or just to go over what you told me so far, there's you're upset about this, and this is the kind of thing that's going on, and this is kind of how we can support you. Am I right in thinking that? Or obviously it will change as per the scenario, but those are the sorts of things to think about. And then signposting as well. So we've talked about so I find signposting really helpful, especially if you've got an angry patient or an upset patient or parent. You can say, okay, I appreciate what you've been saying, and I understand your concerns, and I've taken it on board, and there's a lot to think about and talk about, but why don't we move forward and think about what we can do now? So if you ever feel like you're getting in a rut and you're not really moving, and you feel like you're going around in circles, I think signposting can be a really useful tool then as well to help move it along, or as you would in a normal situation, just to help naturally move the conversation on to the next part. So I've talked to you about what's brought you in today. Why don't we talk a bit more about your child's background? Just to help flow the conversation and show the patient and parent the chunks that you're doing. And then please do not forget your ice baby. To be honest, we often I forget to do this sometimes when I see patients, but I think I probably ask it in different ways. But please don't forget to say, like, what is there anything you're particularly worried about? Was there anything you were hoping for from today? Is there anything you think might be going on? Your ICE questions, you learned it at medical school, but do not forget this when you are when you're doing this scenario. So I think in your 5 minutes, just remind yourself as well, I've got to think of ICE. Like, your communication stage will be your first scenario. You can remember ICE. Maybe just think, I don't want the ice to melt, so I've got to ask it. And I think it's helpful. I often say it's quite a good idea to ask it more than once, not in such an overt way, not like, is there anything, not the exact 3 questions, but just in a probing way, like, is there anything else you're worried about, or is there anything else we haven't talked about that you want to mention? Is there anything I haven't covered? Those sorts of questions can really help, and especially when it's an actor, that can give them the opportunity to give you the information that might really help the scenario. So I think those are useful things to think about. So these are the sorts of things I just have thought of that commonly come up in communication stations. That's a tongue twister. And especially for when I was revising for my clinicals, the sorts of things that I thought about and revised and practiced. So you might need to explain a procedure or an investigation, and I would think about common pediatric types of procedures and investigations as well to kind of help prepare for this. Resolving conflict, so that might be between, to be honest, no. So resolving conflicts, that might be between an angry parent or an angry patient, like a teenager. Those are the sorts of things to think about. Lifestyle factors, so they don't necessarily have to be in an acute situation. It could be in a clinic setting and communicating, say, for example, patients that aren't complying to medication or treatment plans or things that might be implementing their lifestyle. Breaking bad news is always an important one, and one that can come up. So I think people do often use that book, ISC book, but that book covers quite well breaking bad news and how you can go about it in a professional way. Duty of candor, so that's always a really useful thing to mention, and just keep that in the back of your mind for all of the stations. Does duty of candor relevant anywhere? Do I need to have a duty of candor conversation and talk about errors and why they happened and how we'll make sure they don't happen in the future? Chronic conditions, so patients with chronic conditions that you might see in clinic or on the ward or in A&E, there might be communication from that perspective. And then I think safeguarding would be quite a tricky one to come up, but I guess that might be one worth practicing, or at least thinking about how you might answer safeguarding, and just saying, so we have concerns that so say a baby is brought in with bruises, like a 3-month-old baby is brought in with bruises. You could say things like, we're really worried about your baby, as I'm sure you're worried too, but we'd like to investigate them further. And first of all, just make sure that there's nothing medical going on, but also if anyone's caused these bruises to the baby, and how we can keep baby as safe as possible. There's different ways of having safeguarding conversations, and I would be surprised if they came up in your interview. They're more of a sort of thing that come up in clinicals, which is when you're doing your exams to become a registrar, kind of. But I think it's just something to just make sure you think about and have a bit of a refresh on. I wanted to just highlight that it's not necessarily your medical knowledge that's being tested, and it is your communication skills, particularly in this station. So don't use it as a chance to be like, okay, well, why don't we start you on this, and this, and kind of make sure you might be able to link some medical knowledge in, and that's great, but don't think that medical knowledge is going to be the answer, or like an operation is going to be the answer to the communication scenario. It's going to be more obviously about how you communicate and the conversations you're having, and just some things that the issue might underlie in is potentially a misunderstanding, or has the patient misunderstood? Have they had previous bad experiences, or is there anything else going on in their life? Like, I think there's a classic scenario where you've got an angry parent who doesn't want to stay in overnight, but it's actually because their car parking is about to run out and they can't afford to pay for parking overnight. And actually, is there something else we can help with to help resolve the situation? So you kind of just think outside the box. Is there anything else that might be going on? I'm just going to have a drink of water. Bear with. Okay, so now moving on to the motivation/portfolio station. And they've renamed this to motivation because when I applied, you actually brought in a portfolio. You brought in, I think there was only 12 sides of paper we were allowed. So it's very different to surgical portfolios where they bring in like a massive book. But we were allowed to bring in a 12-page portfolio, which they no longer do not require. And they say you can have your own virtual selected portfolio. That basically means a portfolio in your head. They're not expecting to show. You're not expected to show anything. They're not expecting to see anything. It essentially just means a think in your head about the sort of things you'd want to talk about, or the things you're proud of, and the things you'd want to mention. But the main part of this station, as they say, is they want to see your enthusiasm, suitability, and motivation for a career in pediatrics. And that's kind of, when you're thinking about the station, you basically are going in thinking, I want them to know that I really want to be a pediatrician, and I really understand what it's like to be a pediatrician. I know what it involves, and I want them to know that I want to be one. So that's the kind of point of the station. Just remember that in this station, and in the whole interview process, they don't have access to your white space questions. They basically don't use your white space questions again. So other than in like a few situations, which if your interview score is the same as someone else's, then they go back to your white space questions. That's the only time they look at them again in the application process. So just think, if you have don't assume they know anything from your white space questions, because they don't even have access to it. And think, what are your main things that you put in your application form as well that you'd really want these interviewers to know, that makes you such a great person and will make you such a great pediatrician. And they also say that they don't actually have to be clinically relevant, as long as they can be used to demonstrate relevant skills and attributes. And then again, you'll have the two interviewers who have a scoring framework, and they will mark you against the scoring framework. So I had to think of the sort of things they might ask. Again, these are just things I've thought of. And also just a caveat, generally, I'm not part of RCPCH or anything. I'm just an ST3 who's giving some advice, just so that I've got that caveat and disclaimer in there. But just some things to think of. So why do you want to pursue a career in pediatrics? I think that's a really obvious question that they're really likely to ask, because this whole thing is about your motivation about pediatrics. So I can't give you the answers, and I can't tell you why you want to do a career in pediatrics, and that's not what this webinar is about, but just some useful things to think about. So be yourself, be genuine, be enthusiastic. Interviewers can see your enthusiasm. They will have interviewed probably multiple people that day. So I would genuinely be yourself and be enthusiastic, and share any personal experiences that you have had, or any particular moments that have made you realize why you want to do pediatrics. I think my answer was, I'd done an F2 job in pediatrics. I really, really enjoyed it. It was the first job I'd done where I looked forward to going to work, and I didn't want the rotation to end. I really like being around children. I've grown up with lots of children in my life, and I think there's no better job than working with children every day. I think it was something like that, but I can't really remember. What attributes do you think make a good pediatrician, and why do you think you would make a good pediatrician? So I kind of linked those two together, but they could easily be separated or combined. But I would try and think of a few attributes, and also link these back if you can, if the conversation flows in that way and you have time, link these back to yourself. Remember, this is a 10-minute station, so I think they would probably ask you 4 to 5 questions. But again, that will vary on the interviewers and on your answering. So attributes that make a good pediatrician. So I would think organized, because there's lots of things to do as a pediatrician. You need to make sure you're keeping on top of it. Resilient, you see lots of unwell children, you see patients die, and that can be really, really sad, and you need to be resilient. You need to have coping mechanisms for these sort of sad situations. And I would think, to link it back to myself, times where I have shown resilience and developed my resilience was during the COVID pandemic, where I was working in A&E and we'd see lots of really unwell patients, and it was really sad, and seeing these patients on their own, and how I would be one of the only people that they saw during lockdown, and it made me feel really sad, but it gave me the reminder that I needed to do my best for this patient, whether that be help get them better or die respectfully. It's my responsibility to do my very best for this patient. So those sorts of things of how I have, and then in that answer I've kind of brought resilience and also skills of like other clinical skills in that as well. So yeah, just think about what makes a good pediatrician and link it back to yourself. Teamwork, leadership, those are all things that make a good pediatrician, in my opinion. Communication is a huge one as well. And also just liking being around children. That's a key attribute. You want to enjoy being around children, and whether that be a baby or a teenager. What challenges do you recognize in the career? So I think, I don't know if they would ask this, but it's a good question to kind of think of, a good question to make sure that the person that they're interviewing has a good understanding of the challenges, because you don't want people to apply to this job and actually they think it's great and there's no challenges when there really are. So have a think about those sorts of things, like the rota, difficult shift patterns, like I said already, patients dying, patients being unwell, moving around, like in your deanery, that can sometimes be a challenge. But yeah, kind of have a think of those. And I guess I already talked about the resilience one, but link it back to yourself and how you've managed these challenges, or being very busy. So you could talk about, I know that being a pediatrician is very busy, but I try and manage this by keeping organized, making sure I have a really good jobs list, making sure I do the most important things first. So yeah. How do you cope with stress? So I think this is quite a common question in interviews. I think I got this in my medical school interview actually, but I think it's important to be practical, honest, and also quite general. So I think I would probably answer this question in, if I'm stressed acutely, like on the ward, I like to take a step back, work out what I can do now, delegate jobs if I need to, or talk to someone if I need help. But then if I'm stressed generally in life, I think taking time to talk to someone close to me, talk about how I'm feeling, think about what kind of things I can do, even things like having a cup of tea, having time to wind down, going to the gym. So, you can kind of answer that kind of question in multiple ways, like stressed on the ward, stressed at work, or stressed in life, or stressed when you're at home about what happened at work, but kind of have a think about different ways you could answer that, and any kind of question like that. So the portfolio, I think in the applicant guidance, they kind of assume that they will ask you about this portfolio that's in your head. But when they might ask you, kind of tell us about your portfolio, what are you most proud of? So think about certain things that you would definitely want to talk about. Again, these are probably things you would have mentioned in your white space question application. And yeah, things you can mention, like if you did a really good audit or a QIP, if you won an award, like if you won anything at medical school, or you've won any prizes afterwards, like they have an RCPCH prize if you're proud of that. Even things like your team assessment and behavior from F1 and F2, like that can be a really nice thing to mention. That's a really nice way of almost showing off in a humble way. Like I was really proud of my team assessment and behavior. I was really it was really nice to see what the nurses and the other members of the multidisciplinary team thought of me, and it showed me that I need to have more confidence in myself, and that I should believe in myself, and that I'm doing a good job, and I'm going to take this confidence forward for when I become a pediatric trainee, so that I can kind of enjoy work more and build on my confidence and build on my clinical skills. So taking that achievement, but then also projecting it onto when I'm a pediatrician, this is how I'm going to use the skills that I've done when I'm going forward. And yeah, so they might also ask, like, tell us about an audit or a quality improvement project you've done, and then you can use this as a chance to think about your enthusiasm for pediatrics and your skills. And even if it's not a pediatric related audit or QIP, you can talk about how you've done something else and you've now got skills, so that when you become a pediatric trainee, you can do more of these sorts of things. And then they kind of allude to in some of the online content, especially there's a YouTube webinar, which I have mentioned at the end, but it's just on the RCPCH YouTube channel. and it's also on the RCPCH ST1 applicant guide, but they allude to role modeling questions. So kind of, I would just have a think about who is a role model to you and why they're a role model to you. And when you answer this, think about what attributes they have and why you value those attributes, and then why they will make you a good pediatrician. So I think I would just have a good think about that kind of question and how you would answer it, and how you'd answer it well, not just like, my mum's a role model to me because she's great, but like how you would actually answer that question well, not just who you would say. But they do kind of allude to role modeling in the online content. Fine. So now we are on to clinical reasoning. So what time is it? Oh my gosh, it's already been half an hour. So now we're on to clinical reasoning. So this is where they say that they'll give you a scenario. So this is also going to be when you switch your to assessors, a scenario where they ask you to describe the relevant issues and how you would, they will ask you to describe the relevant issues and then also how you would manage the situation. And they say it's at F2 level. They've literally written that in the applicant guidance that you should be at F2 level, not even ST1 level, F2 level. And they want a clear and methodical approach, and they want you to consider your own level and ability. So please just keep these things in mind when you're going into your interview, when you're preparing for your interview. These are the sorts of things that they want you to think about. So these are just my thoughts on how to approach the clinical reasoning question. And they are looking for safe and competent pediatricians or pediatric trainees. So just bear that in mind. I've written this first point saying don't be afraid to ask questions to ensure you understand the scenario. I don't know exactly, just to be honest here, I don't know exactly how this scenario runs, but I think it's a little bit more of a question and answer back and forth from the interviewers and from you. But I'm not sure. But I think that if they do say anything that you don't understand, then don't be afraid to just clarify the odd thing here and there. Also, just, I know it's, again, really tempting to rush, really tempting to just blurt out your answer, but take a few seconds to think how you would structure it, and also the important things you wouldn't forget about. So I think the really important thing is don't forget A to E. There might be some situations when A to E isn't necessarily appropriate, or if there's something really urgent, like say the patient's in anaphylaxis, I guess your airway is compromised by the bronchoconstriction, so you need to give the adrenaline, but you kind of use your A to E appropriately, but sometimes you might not necessarily follow the strict structure. But I think A to E is the most sensible and safest way to go about it. Think about practical things, like if you were actually think about your A&E. If they say you're in A&E, think about your own A&E. What would you actually do if you saw this patient in front of you? So say you had a patient in anaphylaxis, you would probably pull the emergency buzzer, you'd probably call for help, and you'd probably put out a double 2 call. So you could say all those things at the beginning, like and say, I'm worried about this patient, I'd like to pull the emergency buzzer, ask for help, and ask someone to put out a double 2 call to get more help. And then you say, and then I'll go and make my A to E assessment, because you're not just going to do those things and walk off, you're going to actually do your assessment and do things. So go through your A to E and talk about how you would manage it. As I've said already, remember you're an F2, so in this, as they've said, it's F2 level, so you're an F2 SD1, but you're not a registrar or a consultant. So just make sure that you know your limitations and escalate appropriately. So even dealing with an unwell patient on their own, that's almost understanding your limitation. And you can say that, like, I feel like I need more help with this, and that it's not appropriate for me to manage this on my own, so I would ask for extra help, and in the meantime do what I can until help arrives. And you might also want to think about things like, why are you escalating? So say you've got a seizing patient who's in status, like I would call anesthetics to help support the airway. Or if you have a patient with, oh my gosh, what was I going to say? If you have a patient, okay, it doesn't matter. But, know who you'll call and why. And if you don't know how to do something, or you don't know the answer to something, don't lie, don't try and guess. I think the best thing is just to say you'll look it up, or you'll look at the guidelines, or you'll find out. So say you've got a patient in status and you can't remember the first line of status epilepticus, or all you can remember it's a benzodiazepine, you can't remember what else it is. Just say, I'll look at the APLS guidelines and give the first line treatment, which I believe is a benzodiazepine, but I'd like to double check it. Those sorts of things. Just be safe. Don't make things up and guess, because that's not safe, is it? The interviewer wouldn't want you to be doing that to their actual patient. And just think about the other things you can refer to. So I've already mentioned APLS, which is acute pediatric life support. You can also think about your local guidelines, and microguide for things like antibiotics, NICE guidelines. Just have a think about the sorts of things you can refer to. You might be able to, it would be like quite nice to get in there that I would give an SBAR handover. So if that comes up, like if they say, okay, well, your reg has arrived, what were you going to do? You can say, well, I'd give them an SBAR handover and explain to them. And they might even say to you, can you please pretend I'm the registrar and explain to me what's been going on? Like, they might even do that. And basics of history taking, you might, again, it would depend on the scenario, but you might be able to ask a few questions at the beginning, or you might not, but just have a think as to whether or not that's appropriate, and you can ask a few questions to set yourself the scene. Things I would revise, if I had to only revise a few things, these were some things I just thought of, but like the very pediatric topics. So sepsis, obviously, seizures I've already mentioned, and status, asthma management, bronchiolitis, anaphylaxis, type 1 diabetes, safeguarding. I would revise those sorts of things just so that you feel a bit more comfortable with them. And then I have a golden rule. Someone said it to me when I was revising for clinicals, but just always think, could this be sepsis, non-accidental injury, or oncology? Just always think, am I missing that? And I kind of now do always think that, even in patients I see like in A&E. So always think about those three things. That's not like a general golden rule in peds, it's just my own one, but just that's a useful thing to think about, just that you don't feel like you're missing any of the really important things that could be going on. Fine, is that all 4 stations? Reflection, career. Oh no, there's still one more. Oh, sorry, ignore me. And then I also put things, think like a pediatrician. Sorry, I thought I put this slide at the end, but anyway, think like a pediatrician. So think about, I feel like I've put this slide in the wrong place. Let's go back to this slide. So let's go into the reflective practice section. So this reflective practice, they literally tell you what they're going to ask you. So if there is anything you prepare for this interview, is please prepare this, because this is screenshot from the guidance, and they literally say assessors will ask the following, and they tell you the 2 questions they're going to ask. Please, could you briefly describe a significant clinical event you were involved with or observed, and discuss your learning from it? And how do you use similar reflective practice in your daily work? And they have said that they want you to spend the minimum time describing the event and your involvement, and the majority of the time on your reflection. And they also want to know how you're applying your experiences to your future career. They literally say that at the top, how they apply their experiences to their career progression. So just make sure you're aware of all of these things when you're preparing and when you're answering your question. So please, could you briefly describe a clinical event you're involved in and you're learning from it? So I've just had to think about what you could talk about. So first of all, the clinical event, make sure you make your description brief. Don't choose something that's too complicated. So please just make sure you decided your event and practiced saying it before your interview, because they're telling you they're going to ask you this. Don't wing it. You don't need to wing it. You should prepare it. So when you choose your event, make sure it's not too complicated to explain, because you're going to waste your own time explaining it. So you should, try and if you've got just try and think of a few options and maybe go through them with a friend or a colleague, and just think which one would be the most appropriate. Then I would just explain your own role in this situation. Like, were you the F1 observing? Were you the F2 leading it? Kind of just explain how you fit into the whole context. But don't spend too much time on that. Please make sure there's nothing identifiable. Just because you would immediately lose a lot of marks for that, and obviously that goes against any GMC advice. So just make sure there's nothing identifiable in it and make it very anonymous. So the things to think about, you can think about where I've kind of split it into where something went wrong and where something went well. So where something went wrong, so like a prescribing error, any significant incidents either that you've seen or that you've been involved in, any poor teamwork that you've noticed, any misunderstandings that could be between patients and doctors, or that could be between doctors and like interdisciplinary misunderstandings, or it could be like systemic organization related problems. And then things about where something went well. So if you notice that teams working together well, a good resuscitation, someone advocating for their patient. So it could be a doctor advocating for their patient, or it could be a parent advocating for their patient. But those are the sort of things that you could think about. There are obviously many, many more, but these are just some I've thought of. So I'll just tell you. Oh yeah. So then when you want to discuss So then to discuss your learning from it, the sorts of things I would think about is, first of all, so once you've described the event, what did you see that happened? And then what did you learn from it? Well, what did you see other people do? And what did you learn from that? So what did you learn from what other people did? What did you learn from what you had to do or what you were asked to do or what you actually did? And think about the clinical and non-clinical things. So I don't know, thinking off the top of my... Well, I guess I can tell you, so for my interview, because I also had this question, I had recently gone to coroner's court for a patient who was very unwell and died unexpectedly. So I guess when I was thinking about, so first of all, I talked about what happened, but again, briefly. And then I talked about the process of going to coroner's court. What did I learn? So then I talked about, first of all, the clinical side of things. So what I learned about what went wrong. And then I also talked about the non-clinical things. So they talked about the process of significant investigations, going to coroner's court, day-texes, the whole process, because that's a very different process. And again, I hope you haven't had the experience of going to coroner's court or being involved in an SI. But if you have, those are the sorts of things I think you could probably get drawing quite a lot. You could use quite well in this kind of question. And then think about how you've applied this to your practice. So for me, it was... I was thinking about, well, first of all, if I was to see that clinical situation again, how would I apply my learning from that scenario to my practice? And just to clarify, I didn't do anything single-handedly. It was just multiple things happened and I was working that day. So that's why I was in coroner's court. But obviously I learned a lot from it, but just to clarify that. But yeah, thinking about how I've applied it to my practice. So yeah, what I would do if I saw that event, but then also thinking about mistakes, errors, SIs. So my understanding of that whole process completely changed and how I view them completely changed. And then also kind of my thinking around mistakes and errors within hospitals also changed because I'd kind of been involved in one. And then think about what you do differently. So duty of candor is a really good one to mention here. I know I mentioned it earlier, but I think it's also really important to mention here. And I think it's a good phrase to get in, is having duty of candor conversations. And for anyone that doesn't know, that essentially means duty of candor means having an open conversation with patients about things that might have gone wrong and kind of openly explaining that things have happened and exploring why they've happened. You can also talk about day-tex and incident reporting and kind of your understanding of how that makes a difference. Shared learning. So one thing I remember very clearly saying in my interviews that I've told people about the case so that they can learn from what happened, and obviously in an anonymous way, but I've just shared my own learning from the case, and I shared it with the other F1s and F2s so that they could also be aware of the things that can go wrong and how they can result in a significant event. And then also I just think it's always useful to think about the Swiss cheese model and how things can line up when you don't want them to line up in a way to make an error or a significant incident happen. So I think, yeah, for me, I just learned a lot about how mistakes can happen, and it actually doesn't take too many holes in the Swiss cheese to line up in order for an event to happen. So yeah, it was a very important learning opportunity for me when I went to coroner's court. It was scary, but it was good. I actually did it. I went the same week as my ST1 interview. Couldn't change the date of either of them, obviously, but it was a very busy week in my life. Anyway, and then this is a new question. How do you use similar reflective practice in your daily work? Actually, just to go back to this is what's also new is the clinical event. So I know that last year it didn't say, or maybe the year before, it didn't say significant clinical event. It just said significant event. And I think people were doing other things like talking about leadership and teaching, but they now have specified that they want it to be clinical. So make sure you just make it a clinical event and don't talk about, like someone, I remember doing a mock when someone said they'd organize this amazing teaching program, which was amazing and a great answer, but that kind of answer wouldn't, now they say they want a clinical event, that kind of answer wouldn't be appropriate because that's not clinical. But yeah, so now they've introduced this new question. How do you use similar reflective practice in your daily work? So you can relate it to the event. So for me, I am now very mindful of my documentation when I see patients because it's very important. I'm very mindful of when I look at results and I look at drug charts for patients because I understand the importance of it and how not looking at them properly can impact the patient. Escalating early and my reflections on escalating early have also changed. So just relate it back to that. Then you can talk about the importance of reflection for yourself. So like for me, I find reflection really helpful to help me think about a patient in a wider context, think about the different things that might be impacting the patient, but also thinking about your colleagues as well and how they might be doing. I think you need to be quite reflective to be able to do that, and that's a skill that does develop, I think, after when different things happen, and as you go through your career, that develops. I think about the steps. I think it's a good thing to think about the steps you do to ensure you have time to reflect. So taking breaks appropriately, having lunch off the ward, that like having chats with colleagues, those sorts of things are implementing reflective practice in your daily work. And then I also had to think about the different types of reflective practice. So it might be debriefing, and then whether that's just thinking about something in your head or chatting to other people who are involved, talking to seniors or to your supervisor, or doing a reflection on your e-portfolio. But just remembering all of this to remain confidential. And even if you need to put that in your answer, just be like, I always make sure I maintain confidentiality, just so that that's very clear to the interviewers as well. And then also taking on the other side, so instead of reflecting on sad things and things that have gone wrong, but also thinking about things that have gone well. So the importance of complimenting colleagues, doing great X's, highlighting good work, doing things like a positivity board. Those sorts of things are also really important, and they are also reflections. Like I'm reflecting on my colleagues' work and how they've done. And then again, talk about the skills you've learned and the reflections you've made and how this is going to make you a better pediatrician. So always just try and like project it to the future as well. So that's the 4 sections, and then they do the full marks. And then what I was saying earlier was the only time they look back to your white space questions is if your interview score and your total application score. So basically, if you have the exact same marks as your interview score and your if you have the exact same marks as some of your interview and your application, then they look specifically at they prioritize each station. So if you were to boss one station, I would make it the communication one, just because that's the first one they look at if you have the joint marks. But I think I don't think it would be very common to get into this part. Actually, so I thought they go back to the white space questions, but they probably don't. They just look at your interview scores independently. And then after all the interviews are done, you will be starting to be sent offers on the 28th of March, and you'll have 48 hours to then respond to an offer. Fine, let me just go back to that think like a pediatrician slide. So I was just thinking about, in general, the sorts of things to think about, especially for the communication and the clinical scenario stations. So think about other things that might be going on for the patient, their siblings and the rest of the family, like especially at home. Are the parents together? Do they live apart? What's the home condition? Do any of these things impact the child? School, so has the school attendance been affected by their condition, if they have a chronic condition, or have they been is their attendance poor because they just don't want to go to school in context of their illness? Have they missed out on exams? Do they have a long or dangerous commute, or have to take a lot of buses, and that's impacting them? Think about friends, like bullying, feeling left out, peer pressure. Or do those have a part to play in your scenario? These are just things I'm thinking about outside the box that might be relevant. None of these may apply, but some of them might be relevant to your scenarios. Things like compliance with medication. Are there any underlying reasons as to why they might not be compliant? Any contributing factors? And then always think about the MDT. So say you're in a scenario where the patient has poorly controlled asthma. You could think about getting the asthma specialist nurse to see them if your hospital has one. I guess actually my example of poorly controlled asthma is not a very good one, but say they have a complex health problem and they need more support, then you can talk about the MDT. You know, we all love the MDT. And play team is also a really useful one. So say they're really needle phobic. Say you might have a communication station where a patient just doesn't want to have bloods. So you can think about who you can get involved in the scenario to help you, basically. So the play team are always great and help distract and really help make it an easier experience. And then general tips. So when you're preparing, so I've kind of alluded to a lot of these, but make sure you read the RCPCH applicant guide, which is what I have done the screenshots for. Watch the webinar on the RCPCH YouTube. So if you go on the RCPCH page, the applicant ST1 page, at the bottom there's a YouTube channel. A lot of it is actually on the white space questions, but there is a little bit on the interview. But I would just have a listen and a read of that, just in case there's any other hints in there. I did try and link in a few of those hints into this as well, but any tips as well. I think, so what I did, because I was on A&E when I had my interview, it was actually just as COVID was kicking off. because it was February 2020 was my interview. But I listened to